live from the 30th of June 2024. So the end of what we call H1, the first half of the year. And there'll be a little bit of a roundup, but generally speaking, I'm saving that for last week when the quarter is actually over. So for those who listen regularly, this is the new live version that also goes out on the podcast channel. So there is a chance if anybody is around on YouTube, they may be able to tune in, leave some comments, and I'll try and respond to them in real time if they do. Let's see what happens. So interesting week this week, as it often is. We had, if we start from the back, we had a Zoopla report on the house prices. Now they publish about nearly a month in arrears, but they do really attempt to do some more meaningful analysis than the likes of the Nationwide and the Halifax do when they release their indices. So I always like to have a little look into that. I've given them some feedback online as well about the bits that I've seen that I think potentially need a bit more explanation or maybe even some improvement in their metrics. Yet to receive a reply on any of that, but I live in hope, of course. There's a couple of interesting bits from the Bank of England this week, because apart from anything else, the financial stability report, that committee meets quarterly, and it is important in terms of what they say because it's going to inform the regulators, apart from anything else, in terms of anything they might need to change, and it also informs us as investors of anything the Bank of England think is worth knowing that might be being seen in the system, things that might need changing. So I called this week's Hear Me Roar, Katy Perry song, ringing in the ears there, and there was a couple of reasons for that, but partially because also at the end I want to talk a little bit about mindset and something that I observed this week that I think might be useful, and I think will also stoke some opinions from the audience as well, so I'll be interested to hear what anybody thinks as well. So for those who know, I always like to start with a quote, and this week's was, "One reason why so many people are unhappy, not knowing why, is that they have burdened their minds with resentments. These evil thoughts pile right on top of happier and generous ones and smother them so they never get expression. Resentments are a form of hate. What a dearth of goodwill and cooperation there are among human beings and nations. What a world this would be if we all worked together, and as a popular diplomat recently expressed it, played together." And that was from George Matthew Adams, who's an American newspaper columnist. Now you might say, look, that's a bit hopeful, and I would tend to agree with you, but I don't think there's any worse burden you can carry in your life than envy and resentment of others, and you'll see why that's relevant later on. So just want to give one more shout out before I get started for real, for the Property Business Workshop on Thursday this week. Of course, that's election day. We've still got a nearly full room. We've only got a couple of tickets left. Really looking forward to seeing everyone. It will be a great day. There's a super bunch of people that attend. We're talking about risk controls, metrics in investment, how to scale your property portfolio and business, and then some stuff about differing secured debt arrangements and loan structures, which I think everyone will find interesting. And the hope is that it helps people to level up. It is a standalone day. It's not a big pushy sales funnel or anything like that. We do hold them in London because, rightly or wrongly, it's still by far the easiest place in the country to get to, even when you're coming from places like Manchester. Ridiculous though that is, that's where we are. So I'd love to be holding them in the Midlands or somewhere else, frankly, but realistically we hold them in London. So the link to the event, if you're interested, is bit.ly/PBW THREE, PBW3, but spelt in words. So this week's quote was inspired by the fact that I attended an election debate on Thursday night, which was held at a local private school, and it got very salty when the issue of VAT on school fees came up. I wanted to touch on it because of that mindset perspective I talked about, but also because what I saw really incensed me. I needed exorcising from me, but also I think is a fantastic learning point for me, for my children, and for anybody else who might be listening to this. So all will be revealed later on. I'm going to get into that Bank of England reporting, as I said, some of the annual and 6 monthly stuff that gets reviewed and released, as minds turn to stability, because that has been the watchword really of 2024 so far, really, but particularly quarter two. Although you might not agree with that on a geopolitical standpoint, and I would have to defer to you there. We haven't seen the escalations boil over that we thought we might have done when there have been numerous flashpoints. So comparative stability, I think, would be fair. I also want to talk a little bit about a macro success argument over the coming parliament that's got nothing to do with the incoming administration, but you know the old saying, it's better to be lucky than good. So hopefully that will help us out, but let's see how it plays out. So Next week, politics is going to take a back seat while we go into PERDA, as we wait for the OBR to prepare their figures for Rachel Reeves, the incoming Chancellor, to deliver her first budget. 10 weeks that will take, and the first day will come and go without Angela Rayner doing anything of note, and she certainly won't have repealed Section 21 on day one, as she said she was going to. I'm looking forward to it already. Before any of that, though, of course, the macro, and before that, I like to talk about the real-time property market. So on we go. Regulars will know I'm a big fan of Chris Watkin and his weekly UK property market stats show. Don't miss an episode. It's there on YouTube, and there's a printed version in Property Industry Eye online as well, free to access. From the report on the week ending 23rd of June, so June has been extremely consistent week to week as we've got more data. Prices have held, sales agreed prices have held at £350 a foot. That's 3.2% up for quarter two on the sold square foot prices from March, and it's 5+% up from the end of last year. Now remember, I mention it on a fairly regular basis, but there's a 92% correlation between those sales agreed prices per square foot and what happens at the ONS, which is ultimately the Bible of what's happened to house prices, because they've got all the data and nobody else does. So listings stayed more than 5% higher than the pre-pandemic market for the year to date. So 5.4% is the actual number. And net sales were 13.5% better than the equivalent week in 2023. So what election to an extent for the housing market, 4.8% higher than the 17 to 19 average, and 11.3% above the 2023 year to date at this point in the year. So going pretty well. There's more property on the market, to be precise, when the figures were taken, 694,281 pieces of stock than there has been in any month for 8 years. Although it's very close to the amount of stock that came on after lockdown 1, which was of course a false backlog created by that lockdown naturally. That was in about Q3 2020 when the market looked like this, but of course it then sold very quickly, as you'll know if you were in the market at that time. Now, this info is in conflict with the Zoopla market report that's also been released this week, which I'm going to get into later on. But the listings are 888,676, that's so far this year, are a little closer to 2018-19, which were around 860k and around 850k respectively. So we're still a fair bit ahead. I'm left wondering whether 2017 was a great base year as we might think it was, because it feels like many held off because of Brexit. That's certainly what I feel like I remember, but I wasn't chronicling things back then as much as I am now, so can't necessarily say, but maybe a line through 2017 in the future might be an idea. But estate agency pipelines, sales pipelines look healthy. They don't look anything like 2021-22, but they look far better than pre-pandemic, and they look far better than 2023 as well. That can be a false figure, because a fair amount of that, of course, having more in your sales pipeline, is because transactions are taking longer than they used to. So it's kind of difficult to compare over the years at the moment. But anyway, enough real time. Onto the macro feast. We had the quarterly growth figure revisions. So that's the first time the ONS takes a look at the figures they've produced for the quarter before, and then they've got more data in by now apart from anything else, and they revise them, and that's worth a mention and a look. And then we've got the CBI industrial trends and distributive trades, which tell two different stories, so we'll look at them individually. And then of course the guaranteed end to my macro section is the 5-year gilt and swap yield, as you'll know. So growth, is it the final frontier? Not quite, although the ONS have done their first pass, and they uprated UK's growth from 0.6 to 0.7 for quarter 1 2024. The annual figure moved from a paltry 0.2 to a tiny bit less paltry 0.3. Services up 0.8% now in quarter 1, which carried a construction sector that fell by 0.6. Now that's revised upwards because the first pass figures showed a construction sector shrinking by more than 1%. So good news overall on that front. Household spending also up, a positive consumption trend, even though the savings ratio, so remember in the simple world of economics here, you either save it or you spend it. And if you spend it, it's called consumption. That was up to 11.1%, so 11.1% of disposable household income being put into savings accounts. That is treble the rate at some points in 2019. And that was in line with the Bank of England forecasting earlier this year that said the savings rate would continue to increase. It was up from 10.2 to 11.1. Significant and disinflationary. And I don't know how much of that, of course, you can put down to the fact that people can put money in the bank and get a return. Again, and look, it might only be 4% or whatever before you get your income tax applied to it, but nonetheless it's 4% when it was 0 or 0.5%. So there we go. Real household disposable income, which is one of my favourite metrics, also grew by 0.7% in Q1. And that was the same as Q4 2023. So a move in the right direction for the households. Now, the significant revisions are now largely done, but they can go on another 3 years still revising these figures. There are some bits in the granular detail, but I don't think they're going to add value this week. So I'll crack on with the CBI Industrial Trends Report. So that report's on manufacturing and recorded a broadly unchanged month. But the expectation going forward is for a modest increase in output. We know from previous weeks the election announcement might have made a difference here. Total order books improved, but are still below the long-term average. Export order books look particularly weak. Selling price expectations for inflation also moved upwards again, which is in line with the PMIs discussed last week. This sort of chat is not helping the probability of the August rate cut, I'm afraid, folks. The sensible talk from the CBI lead economist, Ben Jones, is that it's a bit of a stop-start recovery, but manufacturers are confident, which has not been the case for some time. And the encouragement is all for long-term solutions, and the overall chat around industrial strategy at the incoming governmental level has been a positive one so far. Enough talk from Labour, it will be time for action. And the final paragraph was well crafted. I'll read it in its entirety. Top of the in-tray should be a cutting-edge trade and investment strategy, a net zero investment plan, and more support for firms to invest in automation and AI. At the same time, a focus on building momentum behind the big three enablers of tax, planning and skills policies within the first 100 days can give firms a clear flight path for growth. Difficult to disagree with that, and good solid business chatter, I think. The print was -18, which was still not great, but versus -33 last month, and the expectations on the consensus were -25. So we beat the forecasts, but we're still negative and still below the historic averages, which is, the historic average is still a negative number, a bit like the consumer confidence index that I also talk about. So on to the distributive trades, which is also produced by the CBI. Now that concentrates on retail sales, and it told a different story. We had a +8 print in May, which was great. We slid all the way back to -24 when the consensus forecast was +1. Now that's a big miss again for retail, and the expectation for next month is now -9. Sales reported to be well below average for the time of year. Similar but slightly less damage is expected for July. Now, again, the weather is being cited. This is at least the third time this year the weather's been wheeled out as an excuse. But of course, early June specifically was pretty poor. So that will have had an effect on seasonal business naturally. But internet sales declined heavily as well. So you can't blame the weather for that, let's face it. So the lead economist on this one, Alpesh Palaja, has come up with some intelligent chat as well, of course. He says, consumer fundamentals are improving, with inflation now at the Bank of England's 2% target and real incomes rising, which of course they are. But it's clear that households are still struggling with the legacies of the cost of living crisis, with the level of prices still historically high in some areas. Well, that is the nature of the beast. Just because inflation is down to 2% doesn't mean that things are going down. In fact, what has been going down, food has gone down a little bit over the last month. It was down 0.3, wasn't it? We talked about the other week. And energy prices have gone down a lot. But it's a bit like losing weight when you're already massively, there's no point putting on 10 kilos to lose 5, is there? You know, but that's ultimately where some of the, it's more like we put on 10 and lost 7.5, but the other 2.5 probably aren't coming off ever. So that's where the UK economy is these days. So not unfair, but of course you can keep wheeling that out as an excuse as well until 2030 at least. But of course it's not easy to come up with meaningful commentary every month, let alone every week. But consumer demand's on shaky ground. B2B is where it's at, and the hope and the commentary is clearly aimed at Labour grasping the nettle and doing what they've said and being pro-growth and pro-business. Only time is going to tell us. And I'm not going to dwell on it for too much longer. So that leaves us with the gilts and the swaps. It's been an up week for the yields, which gets a big thumbs down from me, of course. Opened at 3.917, closed at 4.025, above that psychological 4% mark. It was a bit of a drift upwards, and there was some funny activity on Friday, a bit of ups and downs. But look, the basic tale of the tape is that the restated growth figures mean even less reason to cut rates particularly quickly. The number of times inflation was cited in the CBI reports I've already discussed won't have helped. They're influential reports that are important to decision makers. The market tested 4.075 on Friday, and then it clipped back from there. But you know, I'm a big fan of looking at the psychology of being around these important numbers, and we know 4% is an important number on the 5-year. So it was close, right? The market seemed to react to US news that came out pretty much spot on consensus about pricing, the PCE as they call it, the inflation figure that they like to watch alongside their CPI. I found that a bit strange, to be honest, but maybe it was the commentary that accompanied these results from the Federal Reserve that was interpreted as being slightly hawkish that actually made the difference to our bonds. As I've said, I think we're going to see some decoupling, and I think the market will get that message when we cut relatively soon. Still think probably August, but it's definitely in the balance, folks. And the Fed don't cut for the whole of the year, which I don't think they're going to, because I don't think they're in position to, apart from anything else. Thursday closed 4.023 on the 5-year gilt and 3.928 on the swap. So we nearly had a negative risk premium of 10 basis points this week. Supply of money still exceeds demand at these sort of rates, and we know that. 1 year ago, looking back, it was 4.885 on the swap. So let's be extremely thankful for being nearly 1% lower than that, because that is an ugly place for it to be for buy-to-let investors. So that's the macro done. Next week we'll have the house price indices, the final PMIs for June, and the Bank of England money and credit report, which always needs watching and reporting on. But that still leaves a few reports of interest for this week. I'm going to start with the Bank of England. So the stress test. This is an annual event. And the most important thing to understand before I start on this is not a prediction from them. This is not a projection. This is a genuine attempt to work out where the holes in the system are if X, Y, or Z were to happen. And in fact, X, Y, and Z were all to happen at the same time. That's the point of the stress test. So don't hear these figures and start panicking, right? These come out every year, and always the headlines are the same. There's only really two basic ways from an economic perspective how a shock can occur. Supply side, which would mean things like disruption to supply chains globally, could be geopolitical, could be medical, could even be celestial, you don't know. But an event that causes significant increased inflation in a short period of time. In this event, they see the bank rate rising to 9% and staying there for a year. So that's the model scenario of a really significant disruption to global supply chains. I bet that one caught your attention. Remember, it's a stress test, but 9% would not be a comfortable place for the interest rate to be. Now, the other shock would be a demand shock. So in this way, we think about a recession or a depression even, realistically. In this case, bank rate goes down to 0.1, which I bet also caught your attention, and remain below 0.5% for 2 years in this scenario. Don't get too excited. You might have 20% of people not paying their rent, for example, in the face of such an event. You just don't know. So be careful what you wish for. We're much better off staying fairly steady and it being moving through treacle apart from anything else. But in both of these cases, UK GDP is assumed to drop by 5%, which is about twice as bad as the 2008 crisis. Unemployment rises to 8.5%, which is basically doubling from where we are today. And house prices fall 28%, which is almost double the prior maximum drawdown around 2008. Nearly impossible, certainly not likely. World GDP falls 3%. Now, typically it progresses at over 3% as a rule per year. So we're talking about an event of global significance here. Commercial real estate tanks, as does the stock market. Longer dated bonds have larger term premia. So the yield curve gets steeper. So you're gonna want more money for locking money away for more years in these sorts of scenarios. These are what are called tail risk scenarios. They're very unlikely, but that is completely the point of a stress test. This isn't for, things aren't going particularly well, like a year like 2023, for example. The results of the test are not with us yet. These are just the parameters. And they're interesting. It says a lot about the concerns and the mindset at the time, because these parameters do change every year. This year kind of looks good in as much as there's inflation risk to the upside, as I've been saying some time, and also the supply shocks at this time seem most likely to be geopolitical. So it is a realistic worst case scenario. The parameters for last year's test were set in September 22, and I was a vocal critic of them at the time because they only provisioned for base rate to go to 6%. And at one point, just post-Truss, which is September 22, was when that catastrophic budget was released, just in case you've forgotten, although I remind you every week, the market itself, the bond market, was predicting a 6.5% base rate above the stress test rate. So The bank had no real answers to this on the meeting, the regional meeting I attended after the budget had been released, which was, of course, annoyingly, the budget was released about 7 or 8 days after the Bank of England meeting at the time. So it really messed with the bank's cycle, apart from anything else. But the bank had no answers on it. They just tried to shut me down. And that obviously didn't go down particularly well. So they also stuck with GDP down about 5% and unemployment to 8.5%. Last time they had property prices going down 31%. They don't explain why they've gone from 31 to 28, but perhaps properties looked a bit more resilient than anyone's expected, which it has, beating all the forecasters for 2023, and they didn't want to overcook it this time around. They'd also assumed CPI inflation at an average of 11% for 3 years, with a peak at 17 and household incomes down 13. So there are understandable tweaks this year to fit the parameters of the 2024 world as discussed. When the report is finalised for 2024, I'll be sure to come back to it. I also reported this week that I was feeling positive that if there's any suggestion that the Bank of England's preferred method of quantitative tightening would be under scrutiny. So remember, I talked about this at extent last week, but basically selling bonds into the open market rather than letting them expire, or considering some kind of different methodology. Why not just hold them to expiry, for example? Selling them crystallises a loss, the taxpayer picks up that loss is in the tens of billions. The bank are reviewing this and are going to release their most recent upcoming strategy, which was due to be released anyway. But I think maybe we have to give a little bit of credit to the Reform Party for shining a light on that a little bit more, because it's just not been talked about, despite the tens of billions that we're hemorrhaging on this strategy at the moment, which we don't need to be hemorrhaging. So, but the closest for hope, really, I found buried in the bank's website is this. The bank intends to communicate any future sales schedules for 2024 Q4 or beyond, following the MPC's annual review of the reduction in the stock of purchase gilts over the next 12-month period, which is expected to be announced alongside the MPC meeting on the 19th of September 2024. So they're not moving from their annual schedule, and why should they? But hopefully the torch that's been shone on in the news, and some of the semi-intelligent commentary, and some of the stuff that Gordon Brown said as well, and some of the ways that the European Central Bank operate, which is smarter than the way the Bank of England operate in this department. Let's see what happens, right? So, will they stop selling these bonds and just let them run down organically? They're artificially keeping the bond price up, or the bond yield up, and the bond price down, because they're selling into this market with their constant bond sales. I estimate that to be 10 or 15 basis points unnecessarily on the yields. When they announced they were going to get involved in the bond market after the Liz Truss budget, yields went down by 1 full percentage point on the sort of stuff they were going to trade. That's how much muscle the bank holds. Now, these were particularly long dated gilts they were trading at the time, which are more thinly traded than the shorter dated gilts, but the bank does hold shorts, mediums and longs. It's not just constricted to relatively short-term debt. So it is making a difference, and that difference will be different depending on the maturity level of those bonds. So we'll see what happens. But anyway, the other publication of note by the bank this week was that financial stability report I talked about earlier. The Financial Policy Committee, which is also chaired by the Governor, meets quarterly, and their remit, as a reminder, is to maintain financial stability and support the economic policy of the government, including growth and employment objectives. The intro to the stability report notes what a number of market commentators have been saying. In spite of a relatively risky geopolitical environment, on the face of it, markets are continuing to price in a benign central case outlook. What they're saying there is the markets are assuming that none of the somewhat teetering hot wars that are currently taking place are going to have larger or further reaching consequences. On the flip side, you can find plenty of material on YouTube and the broader internet about how World War III is already underway. The bank assesses that some of the current geopolitical challenges are more concerning and proximate than they were 3 months ago. Now, that is a little bit concerning because the volatility indicators are down from where they were 3 months ago. But there you go, the market does seem to be assuming this kind of best case scenario at the moment. And we haven't, in fairness, seen a lot of the things that could have bubbled over. For example, Iran getting involved in the Middle East, and some of the retaliation that there were between the brief skirmish between Israel and Iran didn't actually go anywhere at the moment. But of course, I'm certainly not a geopolitical expert, so we're rather scenario takers in these scenarios rather than anyone who has real genuine influence these days, I think, in the UK. We're basically relying on what the US want to do. So the bank sees that the commercial banks are overall in a strong position and describe the borrowers, who are the households and the firms, of course, as resilient under pressure, which I think is a fair comment. They do notice that risks are crystallising in the US real estate market. Now, just as an aside here, there's been much larger growth in the US than the UK since the pandemic. UK prices are down in inflation adjusted terms since 2019 as I speak today, right? US real estate prices, residential, are up over 20% in real terms over the past 5 years. And the US average draw rate on a new mortgage, bearing in mind they have a tendency to use 30-year terms on their real estate loans, is closer to 7%, whereas ours was 4.74 at the last count. Their average price of just under $500,000 compares to ours of under £300,000, but of course wages are far higher. Median incomes are $75,000 compared to £38,000 in the UK. So you can see the comparables, but over 20% increase in real terms since the pandemic can't be described as anything other than frothy, at the very least. If you compare the average rebuild cost, for example, this would further strengthen the case that the US market is overbought at this time. That's a very broad statement, of course. Now, the bank also mentions the French elections that have been called, that are taking place this week and next, today and next Sunday, as a risk that markets have reacted to. Markets dislike uncertainty, and at this time, markets dislike the idea of the election of the far right into one of the Western world's established democracies. That's causing the cost of debt in France to increase significantly since Macron's snap election announcement, and causing some to speculate, perhaps correctly, that this might be the best thing to happen to the UK for some time. Why? Well, by default, the UK may become comparatively much more attractive as an investment destination, and there might be an edge by not being in the EU. The bookmakers have got this election priced as a long odds-on shot for the far right to win. So if it plays out as the markets expect, that could be the investment community's response to quite a lot of this. We look very politically stable, with effectively a centrist centre-left party coming in. We've got a couple of people on the front bench that look more like they may well be more comfortable in the Conservative Party. That upsets a lot of die-hard Labour voters, of course, but Labour can't seem to put a foot wrong at the moment. So being the investment destination of choice by default isn't the best, but it does make me grateful that we have a centrist party likely to win next week. The bank also notes that risk premia are compressed, particularly on US equities. So the risk premium is the reward over and above the government bond yields. And the point is there's limited upside for buying much more volatile stocks and shares, including for more leveraged borrowers. Now, this is a sanguine observation, but I'm always reminded of the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent argument. Then, one of the sentences that sends a little shiver down the spine. A reminder that we're nowhere near the soft landing or even no landing just yet. Although financial market asset valuations have so far been robust to large increases in interest rates and recent geopolitical events, the adjustment to the higher interest rate environment is not yet complete, and market prices remain vulnerable to a sharp correction. Gulp. I've spoken of my back of the fag packet point of view. While the 2-year fixes are basically 80% washed through the system and have been refinanced already on residential properties, 70% or so of the 5-year fixes are still running at low rates, and that's just dealing with the housing market, bear in mind. The bank points out there is a large proportion of leverage and high yield market-based corporate debt due to mature by the end of next year, which to some right now will look like an iceberg and then might be struggling to steer their liners away from it. The bank notes it could cause losses that could reduce risk appetite or spike liquidity demand and affect core markets. I'd describe that as a live risk, and I don't believe rates will be much lower than 4.25% or even 4.5% when some of this debt matures, if we're talking about the base rate. Although the yields could and should look a bit more like 3.5% on 5-year debt by then. Bear in mind that's only 0.5% lower than today, though. So if you look like you're in trouble today, you're probably still in trouble by the end of next year, is my current thinking anyway. The bank also notes the vulnerabilities of commercial real estate generally, and particularly points to equity values dropping fairly dramatically in the US. They note the risk of being tainted as fruit of the poisonous tree for commercial real estate globally, even though our commercial real estate has not suffered as much as the US's has. Excuse me. Next, the bank points out that whilst debt-to-income ratios continue to fall in the face of decent nominal household income growth and low unemployment, that many UK households, including renters, continue to remain under pressure from higher living costs and higher interest rates. However, they do calm the nerves somewhat with the next observation. The share of households spending a high proportion of their available income servicing their mortgages is expected to increase slightly over the next 2 years, but is likely to remain well below GFC level. Mortgage arrears remain low by historical standards and are expected to remain well below their previous peaks. I noted when they were close to GFC levels in the granular detail when I analysed the FCA quarterly data earlier this month, but I agree the relative position is nowhere near as bad as, say, Q1 2007, when the writing was already on the wall, but of course we were still some way away from the actual crash. So overall, debt vulnerability looks better than it has done over the past couple of years, with high risks concentrated in pockets of highly leveraged corporates. Then the bank moves on to tuck into private equity, a sector that absolutely flourished and made the very most of the cheap money of the 2010s and early 2020s. The thing to watch is the debt maturity. When do these low rates drop off? Valuations can be opaque and, frankly, unjustifiable, which reminds me a bit of some vendors, to be honest with you. The bank sees there are some risk management practices to PE markets and loans that need improvement, and they've said as much. The bank then goes on to suggest that the credit conditions in the mortgage market are reflective of what's going on at the moment. This is them marking their own homework as usual, but overall I'm inclined to agree with them. People are not being offered loans they can't afford, ultimately, as happened in the past. They close with their typical concerns over the non-bank sector or shadow banking lending sector, as they often do, but as usual they've got no real answers to their lack of oversight or data here. They do note that hedge funds have been increasing their leverage positions of late. Seems like they're learning to trade in the new world of more expensive lending. Ultimately, that concludes the stability report summary. Nothing revolutionary in there, but a good reminder of where the landmines still lay on this path immediately ahead of us as an economy. I also wanted to take a look at the Zoopla house price index before finishing on my soapbox for this week about mindset and tax changes. Zoopla finally sees house prices at 0% over the past 12 months. They've been generally a little bit negative for quite a few months. In their defence, though, it wasn't much of a drop. I don't recall them suggesting much more than a 1% drop at any stage in this most recent cycle, so they've been very flat indeed. They expect a 1.5% rise in their index by the end of the year now. I think this is an underestimate of where the ONS will be at, as already discussed numerous times, but it doesn't look like a terrible prediction given the stop-start nature of the current recovery from the doldrums of late 2022 and 2023. They also maintain UK house prices are currently 8% overvalued. Now that's their quote marks, not mine. I think this is fundamentally incorrect, but it's important to draw a distinction between listing prices or asking prices and the estate agent practices around overinflation of listing prices in order to win business, which really isn't needed at this time because there's so much stock, and then compare that to the price that houses actually transact at. Remember, Zoopla is operating from its wide database of market prices that people actually list on Zoopla at, so we need to be careful with turns of phrase like this, I think. They also still see Southern England dropping as a market and the rest of the UK increasing. They also point out the election seems to throw no one off their balance and the market is ploughing on. They have demand 6% up on last year and sales agreed 8% up, which correlates very closely with Chris Watkins' figures. They also point out that 75% of the projected sales for this year, which they still have of 1.1 million, are either complete or are in the sales pipeline, which is simply now because we're halfway through the year. They see the prices of semis and terraces up and of detached houses and flats down, but the differences are quite marginal, 1% either way, so I wouldn't read too much into that. They do see activity slowing in the market anyway, however, given that we're approaching the summer period. Now, Zoopla doesn't go into much detail about their affordability measure, so it's difficult to critique effectively. However, it does take into account household incomes and mortgage rates, they say as much. I've critiqued some of it openly on LinkedIn in the interest of trying to provoke debate and also get some more detail, but find myself shouting into a bit of a void, unfortunately. For example, are they using real household disposable income, average incomes? There's a 4% cut in tax of late to consider. That's manifested itself through national insurance, of course, but has that been taken into account? I don't know. So I can only speculate, and my sense is that their measure could do with an overhaul. Nevertheless, I've used their graph of this week's image because it puts things into a nice historical perspective. I don't think we can accept that houses in Q4 1989 were basically twice as overvalued as in Q4 2007, but it could have been the difference in leverage back then and also mortgage rates, apart from anything else. But I have written before about the late 80s and how bad the situation was and how it corrected itself, which interestingly was about 6 or 7 years of relatively high inflation and house prices moving downwards slightly. So it was only on the face of it, what looked like a very small correction of less than 10%, but in real terms, a really significant correction in house prices of nearly 50%. But I don't think we'll go back to the mad days of the 80s anytime soon, apart from anything else. I don't disagree with Zoopla's statement for the moment, though. Mortgage rates are expected to remain in the 4 to 4.5% range for the rest of the year. This supports sales volumes and low single-digit levels of house price growth. House prices in the south of England are expected to continue to underperform the UK average as they realign with incomes. They also note that income growth is the key to supporting sales and demand. I might go a little bit further and suggest that continued inflation will continue to support nominal price growth, and there will be some continued nominal inflation, as I've discussed. So on that subject, I ran a poll on LinkedIn this week, and I thought I'd share the results with you. What will the inflation rate be over the next 12 months? Options I gave: below 2%, 2 to 2.5%, 2.51 to 3%, or above 3%. Now the votes were 13%, 41%, 19%, 27%. So the winner was 2 to 2.5%, and in second place was above 3%. And my personal vote, which I only give my view after the poll has closed, although if you follow a lot of what I do, you'd probably know where I was, is still above 3%, and I think more like 3.2 as it goes. So I'm only just at the above 3% category. But expectations can be as important as reality. So let's see how and when core inflation adjusts, and numbers that are pumped out after July's energy price cap drop as well. So please indulge my soapbox point now for a few minutes, because I think there's a useful debate here and potentially some learning points. I was lucky enough to attend a political debate with the 5 main parties and their candidates for election in Solihull this week, and I took my 2 eldest children along as a taste, as they've shown some interest in the election. It was held at Solihull School, an independent school that's been in the town since 1560, an institution, if you will, an institution I'm proud to say that I attended thanks to a 100% scholarship back in the 1990s. That does offer me a somewhat unique viewpoint. My parents had to make sacrifices just to afford the bits that were still more expensive than state education, such as the uniform, whereas 95% plus of my peers seemed, comparatively to me at the time, to come from much better off families. That experience left me with no chips on either shoulder, though, thankfully. It interested me, it gave me something to think about. It didn't inspire me, but teenagers can be volatile, as many will know. I did little of meaning with my education or my degree, and the non-vanilla pathway I followed in my career until I was sort of 24 or 25 as it goes. So if you're doing anything of meaning before about 25 and you're listening to this, you're way ahead of where I was, so don't worry about it. What it did do, though, is it instilled within me a strong drive to give my own children the same opportunities that I had. Sadly, the 100% scholarships are long gone. Fees are up well above inflation, as many will know and has been widely publicised. But the school is not owned by private equity or profit maximisers, so I feel very fortunate on that front. When I signed my first 2 children up on paper that day, I couldn't afford it. But on my forecasts I could, and I changed my forecast to I'm going to work as hard as I need to be able to afford it. Now, there's a number of points there. I'm lucky enough to have a pathway and opportunities where the harder I work, the luckier I get. Well, I've always loved that phrase, and I've seen it play out in real life many times, and it's worked for me thus far. There's a bit in that saying missing about risk management, and of course risk versus reward, but no saying is perfect, right? So there we were on Thursday night, and I pre-submitted a question which was approved for me to ask in the assembled company. It wasn't answered very well. I mean, these are politicians, right? And I deliberately stayed away from the VAT topic, as I knew it would be relatively incendiary. Instead, I wanted to know what policies in their manifesto were going to help the local people of Solihull, and got, a few trotted out answers that weren't particularly good. But anyway, to be clear, this event was open to members of the public. They had to pre-book tickets, but they were free. But it wasn't the usual safe environment or the walled garden of the other private school parents who, as you would expect, are pretty much vehemently against the VAT situation, although not all of them are. So for those who don't know, the proposal is that Labour are going to put VAT on private school fees. Now, the VAT question, of course, did get asked, and it was actually asked in the form of 3 questions, which all came in a row and made some different points that I hadn't necessarily considered. Firstly, does the Labour administration realise this will make private schools more selective, more elitist, and disadvantage people from minority ethnic backgrounds, making the schools less diverse, based on household incomes from different groups? Does the Labour administration realise how many SEN children are schooled in the private sector, because the local authority simply can't provide for them. And does the Labour administration think it's right to penalise those who are prioritising their children's education over other discretionary spending? Now, you can imagine this was a pretty tough gig for the Labour candidate, who is polling fairly strongly in what used to be one of the safest Conservative seats in the country. However, all she could do is wheel out the party line, which I hadn't heard before. All parents are equally aspirational for their children. I had to restrain myself at this point, to be honest. My want, on reflection, was to invite that candidate on a tour of some of my portfolio where I've been in the past and observed exactly what aspirations some of my tenants do and don't have for their children and what they've prioritised. It felt like a line from the Communist Manifesto. This isn't about money. Bursaries are still available, although they're extremely competitive, of course. The postcode lottery defines 90% of the standard of education in the UK anyway, and there are inches and perhaps a few feet between the Solihull State schools, but miles between some of those and some in an area where the property prices are half what they are here per square foot. That's not changing particularly quickly, and that is driven by money, but also by the mindset that comes alongside. The ideology was destroyed most effectively by the Liberal Democrat candidates. And if that doesn't tell you something, it probably should. They described it as regressive, badly misguided, and a policy that will have some poor unintended consequences, which I do particularly agree with. I agreed with all of it whilst accepting my self-interest in the entire situation. So as a fair commentator, I should recuse myself really of having an opinion. But that was not the best bit, and that's not why I've brought this up. That was afterwards. The debate was chaired by the headmaster of the school. Afterwards, there was an opportunity to approach the candidates and the headmaster to have a more informal chat. I went to congratulate a couple of the candidates on what I thought was an excellent performance and overheard a conversation that made the hackles on the back of my neck stand up. A family had approached the headmaster and opened by suggesting with open glee in their voices that the school might have to close. The head handled this far better than I would have and simply calmly informed them that the school had been around for nearly 500 years and would be fine, thank you very much. They then proceeded to lecture him about this was fair and all that people want is some fairness, struggling not to spit with their open disgust towards private schools. They had no argument of substance behind this simple value judgment. Now look, they're entitled to their opinion. Of course, it's a free country. But that was me restraining myself for the second time that night, because what I could hear and what I observed was their mindset and their approach to life. It spoke absolute volumes. It's fair to assume they live within relatively close proximity to the school, so an affluent part of the country, and certainly a more affluent part of the Midlands. They've had some of the same luck that I've had. My luck was also in the fact that my parents valued education very, very highly, not equally to everyone else. That meant time spent on me before scholarship exams at a young age that benefited me greatly. That's what I was given. The rest I've had to do myself. It's never been as clear to me that the answer for those who openly displayed envy and some other very negative characteristics is still as it has ever been. Full Jordan Peterson, 12 rules for life, clean your room and then go and sort yourself out first. Don't expect the state to do it for you. As a closer to this debate, something that would really have upset those clapping loudly in favour of the VAT situation on Thursday night. The really rich at the school, which I would estimate are about 10 to 15% of the parents, are mostly delighted by the VAT situation. Why? Because it will make the school more exclusive. They're happy to stay in that walled garden. There's not a whisper from Eton, or Winchester where the PM was educated, or Reigate Grammar, a private school where our incoming PM was educated, whilst he was raised in Surrey, before his postgrad at Oxford. And I'm not bitter about that. I went to Oxford University myself. I'm just pointing it out. Wonder how many from the middle or upper middle, willing to strive to make the sacrifices that his parents did, will be denied that opportunity by this policy. So, that ends my rant. Thanks for listening. I'm aware it's a divisive issue and would like to point out that this isn't about private schools being better than state. Indeed, my choices have led me to follow a strategy to ensure my children spend the majority of their free time integrating with children from other completely different areas of the country and backgrounds outside of school, which keeps their feet on the ground and ensures they live in the real world. There are endless pluses and minuses, but what I do support is a free country where those who do choose to make sacrifices get rewards. I'm willing to pay a relatively large amount of money for what I think is potentially quite a small edge. This is values driven, no more or less than that, and the marginal benefit of education, the network and the soft skills I believe are worth the sacrifice. And that's it. The most successful people I know went to state school or were scholarship pupils at private schools. There's something interesting in that dynamic. The biggest wastrels I've ever met went to the supposed finest schools in all the land and never knew an ounce of struggle. They fit the bill of the old adage of one generation to make it, one to enjoy it, and one to lose it, if you've never heard that one before. I'm hoping this will generate a bit of debate, and frankly, I'm looking forward to it. But that's the end of this week. Well done for getting to the end. Thanks for staying with me if you stayed throughout. And remember, we've got a couple of tickets left for the Property Business Workshop on Thursday on Election Day, bit.ly/PBWTHREE. And this will be the last time I have to say that we only have to deal with this election claptrap for one. Someone's just commented, and I completely agree. It's exactly what one of the candidates said the other night. Politics of envy and jealousy. And I'm hoping we can stay away from all that. But it absolutely was. It was just a really, really disappointing part of the whole performance of what looks like largely a non-ideologically, or at least weak ideologically driven left-wing government coming in. But I'd rather them than the National Rally. So let's see what happens. But yeah, for the last time, we're not going to have to deal with this election claptrap anymore. Not in the UK anyway, although we have one eye on France, I'm sure, by the time we get to next week's supplement. So thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. And remember, keep calm. Always read or listen or watch the supplement and carry on. Thanks.